Olá, boa noite a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindos a mais um colóquio da pós-graduação. Hoje é um colóquio especial, contamos com a parceria do Grupo de Pesquisa de Estomaterapia. Estamos aqui com a ilustre professora Vera Gouveia, que vai ser nossa moderadora, e a participação de um professor internacional. Lembrando que ao receber o certificado, vocês também vão receber o link para a lista de presença pelo chat. Então, muito bem-vinda, professora Vera, é uma honra recebê-la aqui. Muito obrigada pelo aceite do nosso convite. É uma honra para a gente.
Obrigada, Mariana. Obrigada, Mariana. Boa noite a todos. É um prazer estar aqui de novo nessa associação com o Colóquio de Pós-Graduação. É sempre muito bom estar falando com os alunos de pós-graduação, da Escola de Enfermagem da Universidade de São Paulo, de todos os nossos programas, de todos os programas que temos lá, programas bastante bem qualificados junto à CAPES. Então, é um prazer estar aqui e hoje trazendo o nosso professor visitante. Nós estamos desde segunda-feira, desde o dia 31 de julho, recebendo o professor Dr. Kevin Yu. O professor Kevin Yu é professor associado da Escola de Enfermagem da Universidade da Queen's University, de Kingston, lá no Canadá. É um parceiro de sempre, é um parceiro nosso há muitos anos, que tem um vasto currículo, especialista, é estomaterapeuta, muito mais atuando principalmente em wound care, em cuidados de pessoas com feridas, tem uma vasta publicação em revistas de altíssima qualidade, de robusta política editorial, tem inúmeras parcerias com vários países, com vários pesquisadores de vários países, inclusive aqui conosco, o nosso programa com a nossa escola, com a Escola de Enfermagem da USP, através do Programa de Enfermagem na Saúde do Adulto, PROESA, e trazendo hoje, portanto, um tema que muito nos interessa, falando a respeito de como selecionar as melhores evidências para a prática, a implementação da prática em estomaterapia. Embora a gente fale na estomaterapia e a gente fale das nossas 3 áreas, quando a gente discute a questão de seleção de evidências, isso se aplica para qualquer área de especialidade, para qualquer das nossas áreas. Então, welcome, Professor Kevin Yu. I was introducing you, I was introducing your research, your publications, your partnership with us and with the many researchers around the world. It's an honor. It's an honor to have you again with us as a visitor professor at our program, in our School of Nursing. Working together with our research group, in which today we have this partnership with all the programs, the graduation programs in the School of Nursing. So thank you very much. I talked about your subject of our lecture today. Also, you will talk about the how to select the best evidences for the implementation in clinical practice in WC. Of course, this issue is we can apply your knowledge for all of the specialties in nursing. So thank you very much. Have a nice lecture. Be welcome again with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a warm welcome, Professor Vera, and nice to be able to come back to Brazil. It seems like, coming back to see my family, and Professor Vera is like my slightly older sister, and she always looked after me so well, and I always get such a warm welcome from all the Brazilian friends and students and the faculty here. So it's such an honor for me to be present again, to be back to Brazil. So I've been assigned to talk about topic, and I've changed slightly in terms of making it more adaptable to what we're going to be talking about today, we're looking at evidence-informed practice, focusing on how to select and how to implement evidence. And I think there's a lot of science behind implementation, knowledge translation, and I'll highlight a few different models today, and just to help people to understand the differences in terms of implementation versus knowledge translation and the different tools available to us. And when I'm presenting, unfortunately, I cannot see the audience and see your comments. So please bear with me. And I think there will be some time for us to have a dialogue about some of the message that will be talked about this evening. I want to start with talking about some of the statistics at least in Canada. The Estomaterapia continue to be a very vibrant healthcare sector and a very vibrant industry as well in terms of providing care for people who have an ostomy. It's estimated about 135,000 people living with ostomy in Canada, and there's about 13,000 new ostomy surgeries performed every year. And of course, you have to put things in context because our country is much smaller compared to Brazil. So even those numbers may not be a very big number from your perspective, but in Canada, they are big numbers. And those numbers continue to rise because we're seeing a lot of people with cancer. We're seeing a lot of people with a lot of different bowel diseases that require ostomy surgery. And the problem, of course, we all know that because we are WCN, that we recognize ostomy care can be quite challenging, and especially when there's leakage with the stool effluent leak into the skin, and it can cause irritation. And also we recognize the skin barrier has a lot to do with whether it can promote healthy skin or damage the skin. Because when you have a barrier, it affects the evaporation, the vapor loss from the skin area. So if the breathability of the material is not that great, it can potentially cause maceration and other problems. And we also recognize with the use of adhesive, a lot of the material do have some type of sticky material, adhesive material, that with repeated removal and application, it can cause mechanical trauma and leading up to skin damage. And that's not really new to us, but I think the important part is how we capture some of those complications. I think there's been a lot of different attempts, different tools, research, really try to capture and rate and categorize different types of injuries and the severity of those damages. And I think I think this is a big challenge for us in terms of providing ostomy care, to really come up with a more user-friendly, more standardized language to talk about peristomal skin complications, and also how to categorize the severity. Is it the surface area, or is it the depth of the injury, or is it the kind of other pathology in terms of infection, coexisting infection, or coexisting inflammatory diseases like pyoderma gangrenosum? So in general, we classify those type of complications as mild, moderate with more burning, erosion, and severe with more ulceration. There's maybe whipping, painful lesions, and bleeding going on. But I think the challenge is ongoing in terms of providing a more standardized taxonomy to classify and to describe some of those damages. And the other way of classifying peristomal skin complication is the PMASD or PMARC, PMARSI. Depends on the etiology of the complications. So it could be related to moisture. Maybe the appliance is too thick. Maybe it's trapping too much moisture. Maybe there's a lot of leakage resulting in moisture damage. So the skin is exposed to external moisture, either stool or urine, and it can cause dermatitis, maceration, and create an ideal environment for fungal infection. Versus, there's also PMRC, peristomal medical adhesive related skin injury, and that is related to the mechanical trauma with the skin stripping, causing skin tears, causing skin lesions, causing all kinds of other mechanical related irritation of the skin. So you can see that just by describing in the last couple of slides, the variations, the nuances around the different types of problem, whether it is focusing on the etiology versus the presentation of the lesions and the extent, the severity of the skin damage. But overall, the incidence of peristomal skin complications continue to be quite high. In some of the studies, they estimated up to 75% ostomy patients have peristomal skin complications. And that's a very, very high number of individuals. I'm actually quite alarmed by such a high prevalence of complications, despite all the new products, despite a lot of the education that we provided for our patients. So the consequence, there are many different consequences and problems associated with peristomal skin complications. It definitely requires a lot of our attention, our time, and our care for those individuals who develop complications. And there may be increased amount of product utilization. And of course, we're aware a lot of those products are very, very expensive, especially in this environment. Funding is very, very limited for patients with stoma. So if you have to use more product and patients may not have the financial means to procure, to obtain some of those materials. And as a result of that, because of the pain, because of the erosion, because of the leakage, it can definitely affect people's quality of life. And I think you are the experts really in this area, as in Brazil. There's been a lot of research done and a lot of tools being developed from Brazil to evaluate the quality of life among individuals with stoma. So we actually look at Brazil to provide a better guidance in terms of looking at how we can address quality of life issues. And we also know that it can associated with quality of life. It affects people's relationship. It can promote social isolation because of all the complications. And in fact, when you look at in comparison with other chronic conditions like heart failure, such as people who have kidney failure and they're on dialysis, or people with recurrence of breast cancer, the quality of life among people with stoma, with skin complications, they're so much worse compared to all the other scenarios, other type of patients. Just really highlighting how disabling, how devastating it is when people develop some of those complications. And coming back to talk about evidence, we've been doing a lot of prevalence studies. We've been doing a lot of cross-sectional studies to describe, to understand. Yes, we validate again that the quality of life is very, very poor, but there's very little interventional studies. There's very little concrete strategies that we can put in place to improve people's quality of life, that we can improve the skin condition and reduce the occurrence of those complications. So that continues to be a big challenge for us as WCNs to think about moving forward the direction of research, direction of evidence that we need to produce. And no surprise in terms of the cost associated with the management of those type of complications. The more severe the complication is, the more likely that the cost is higher in the management of those complications. And this is just to highlight that compared to between mild and severe, it's 6 times difference. Moderate to severe, 4 times difference there. And this is another survey that was being done to capture the amount of time WCN used to manage complications. Across the globe, you can see the average time that WCN used to manage, prevent, and also to treat those type of peristomal complications. Huge amount of time and huge amount of resources. So in Canada, Dr. Kim LeBlanc and a few of other people in our association, we did a survey, a study. We asked about 500 people to complete the survey, and all the respondents and their nurses reported that on average, patients spend more than $1,000 a year on ostomy supplies. And a lot of times, the cost is not being covered by the government. So they have to pay out of their own pocket. And you can imagine, a lot of individuals, they may be older, they may have lost a job, and they don't really have the financial means to pay for the additional cost. But the good news is, and that's why we love to present this study, because a lot of those individuals, patients who develop complications, peristomal complications, 60% they actually look for the help from the WCN, from our NSWOC, nurses specialized in ostomy incontinence. And as a result of that, there is a significant less spending, less utilization of ostomy supplies among individuals who actually get the support from the WCN. And really, in a way, it's not a direct validation, but at least I think there is a relationship between the support of WCN and the reduction in cost and the reduction in terms of the complications. And I think we can all recognize some of those stomas could be very, very challenging to manage, and it's not always easy to come up with a standardized solution to handle some of those problems. And that's why we need to continue to generate some of those evidence in terms of intervention. What can we do to prevent? What can we do to manage? What can we do to treat some of those type of complications and problems? And over the years, there's been a lot of changes, the evolution of supplies. And when you think about this picture, historically, what people have to wear when they have a stoma. And of course, you can imagine using those type of material. It looks like there's some steel, some metal components to it. And they don't really conform to the skin. They don't hold stool very, very well, resulting in a lot of leakage. And some of those, in the historical museum, you can see some of those old ostomy supplies, and then evolve into the use of coria, softer material that can conform to the skin. But the problem with coria is the rubber derivative. It can increase the risk for sensitivity and allergy reaction. And then the next wave of evolution and improvement, innovation, is the introduction of hydrocolloid. And there's been a lot of different types of hydrocolloid type appliance available to us for the management of or prevention of peristomal complications. And now I think the next phase is to look at the different types of additives that we can put into integrated into the hydrocolloid material, integrated into the adhesive to prevent skin damage, to protect the skin better from moisture damage. So before we carry on with some of the examples, I just want to interject with coming back to the topic about selecting evidence and how to implement evidence, because that is really what we're trying to address this evening. So the terminology is about evidence-informed practice versus in the past we talked about evidence-based practice. We changed the terminology because evidence-based, it's very static, and it means that whatever you do is based and you looked at the evidence, versus evidence-informed practice or evidence-informed nursing. It's an ongoing process. You continue to integrate patients' values, their preference. You continue to integrate the best evidence as they become available. You continue to draw on clinical expertise. So it's a very fluid, very dynamic process in order to change the practice from time to time. Depends on what evidence is available. And I like this model because it's not really, it's not hierarchical. So it's not saying that research evidence is superior to patient values, because yes, you may have evidence there in terms of the scientific evidence, but equally important is the patient preferences and the values. And as this model continues to evolve, the more circles, the more boxes add to how we conceptualize, how we define evidence-informed practice. And I like this because what's missing is not just about the evidence, not just about patient preferences, not just about clinical judgment, but we need to consider the healthcare environment altogether as well. Because even if you have the best evidence, the patient is in agreement and like the product, and we know that this is going to work. But if the healthcare environment, if the system, if the policy does not support those type of changes, does not support the funding of that type of product, we continue to face challenges. We can continue to have problems to enact, to implement evidence-informed practice. So I think those 4 different quadrants and 4 different boxes are very important to consider. So how do we implement, how do we translate evidence-based idea into practice? So there are 5 A's here. So first, ask the question. And when we think about selecting evidence, you should always be mindful of what you're asking. You cannot just say, well, I want to do better in wound care. I want to do better for my ostomy patients. But that is not a question. So be mindful of the key question you want to ask, because that would direct the way that you're going to look for the literature, that will direct you to look for the right evidence, whether it is patient preference, your clinical experience, or the scientific evidence. And the second A is access to information. It's not just about literature search. You always have to talk to your patients. You have to talk to colleagues in terms of getting some of those variety of different ideas of information to integrate in part of the evidence-based practice model paradigm. And then the next step is the third A is appraise information. You need to figure out whether the information is really high quality enough, adequate, appropriate for the consideration. So you have to critique the evidence. And then the final component is applying the evidence. And there are 2 A's there: applied information, and we'll come back to talk more about implementation, knowledge implementation. And many models out there, they talk about different ideas. But when you look at the boxes inside the model, they look very, very similar. What's similar here is the importance of looking at the last A, audit the impact. You need to monitor the outcome, because you could have done everything, but if you don't look at the outcome, look at what's being implemented, how it's being implemented, what happened when the implementation occurred. And that is not completing the loop, because with that audit, with that feedback, you can actually promote and encourage this cycle of evidence-based practice to go on. So asking the right question. And for the last few days, we have courses working with some of the graduate students at University of Sao Paulo. And the idea is to enhance their research skill and understanding of research designs. And we start with telling them that you need to come up with the PICO question if you're doing interventional studies. And PICO stands for population, I for intervention, C for comparison, O for outcome, and T for the time. So you need to identify what population you're talking about. Is it the ileostomy patient, colostomy patient, ileocondyly patient? Intervention, what is the type of intervention that we need to address? What is the control group being compared to the intervention when you're looking at the study? And then the outcome. Are the outcomes appropriate and relevant for the patient population you're looking at? And also the time frame. Unfortunately, a lot of the studies in the WCN literature, the follow-up time is very, very short. We don't really know in the long-term effect of a certain type of intervention. We don't really know the long-term outcome. I think when I look at the literature, there's been a lot of interest, for example, using a virtual platform or developing educational program to help people prevent peristomal complication. But the follow-up time is so short. Yes, you may be able to demonstrate good outcomes, but we know that people get tired. People get less adherence with and become more forgetful about what they've learned. A lot of erosion of knowledge. So we don't really know after 6 months, after a year, after 2 years, whether people are able to retain some of those information, whether the educational intervention continue to be effective. So anyway, so I think that's why going back to the point about time is so vital when we think about the effectiveness and looking at the evidence, assessing the evidence. Obviously, not all studies and not everything we do or not every question we ask is related to intervention. So there's also another acronym is PCC instead of PICO or PICO. We can think about population, the concept, and the context. And so there may not be an intervention, but there should be a key concept that you're interested in, whether it is the peristomal complication as a concept or a pain, peristomal pain as a key concept. And then we can look for the appropriate material to inform our practice. And there are a variety of different studies available to us. They could be non-experimental. A lot of the quantitative study, they classify as observational. You observe what's going on, you follow some of the patients, and you don't really intervene. Versus you can have studies that is called quasi-experimental. So now you may have a comparison group, intervention and a control group. But in a quasi-experimental study, you don't have randomization. Versus a true experimental study, it should be a equivalent to a randomized control design study. There should be a randomization. There should be a control group and other characteristics that come along with RCTs. And this is you might be familiar with this pyramid already because we showed it every time we talk about evidence. It's really the hierarchical structure of evidence, one stacked above the other, indicating the strength of evidence. The strength is determined by how well we can eliminate bias. The strength is determined how confident we are about the outcome, the results of the study. At the base, you see there's case report, case studies. They're very, very important in terms of generating new ideas, proving the ideas. But there's a lot of bias. You may not always be confident about case series or case studies because we handpicked patients to use certain type of ostomy product. Of course, you want to choose the most easy patients or the patients that you think are most compliant with the protocol to be included in those case series. And they may not be representative of the larger population or the larger patient clinical population. And then as we move up, then you have the case control studies, cohort studies, and then the randomized control design studies. And the value of the randomized control design is to eliminate as much bias as possible. And I said this before to some of the students who participated in the master's class, and I don't always believe that there is we need to follow this pyramid. Because at the end of the day, what is the best study is about what design is able to match the research question. If you're trying to determine the risk factors for peristomal damage, you are not going to use a randomized control design to do that. It's difficult. So you might do a cohort study. You might want to do a case control study. And the difference, and quickly, the cohort study is usually is a prospective. You start with the exposure, let's say people who got the surgery with the stoma, and you follow them over time and see who developed peristomal complications and who did not, and looking at how they're different. Versus a case control study, we start with the complications have already developed, and you go back in time retrospectively to look at the factors that influence the development or associated with the development of those complications. So you can imagine, if your research question is not about intervention, a randomized control design study is not really that appropriate. And not to forget that there's another category of qualitative studies that are equally very, very important to inform and provide evidence for practice. But that would be another conversation, another opportunity to talk about qualitative study maybe at some point. But what the randomized control design study is able to help us, and why it's so powerful and why it's preferred, is that we can establish cause and effect relationship. All the other study design is only establish association, probability, likelihood. You can never say that one A cause B until you use a randomized control design study. So that's why it's very important in medical and nursing science. When we think about treatment, you want to confirm that the treatment is actually causing the effect. The treatment is actually saving life. The treatment is actually preventing peristomal effect as peristomal complication, the cause and the effect. And that's the only way to link the relationship in the randomized control design. To give you an example why it is so important. For example, I know your winter is quite warm, especially today. I was out walking for half an hour and the sun was very strong. I was sweating in the wintertime. And of course, when there's a lot of sun, when it's hot, people eat a lot of ice cream. So there is a relationship between ice cream consumption and the temperature. With the sun, with the heat, there's also a high relationship between the sun and the and heat stroke and people getting sick. So because there's such a strong relationship, if you look at statistics doing a correlation evaluation, there's always a strong relationship between ice cream and feeling sick. So you can see that, yes, because they were strongly related to the temperature, that's why they developed this strong relationship when you look at statistics. But it doesn't make sense, right? Eating ice cream does not always, would not cause a heat stroke for sure. So that's why the correlational design, correlational studies cannot confirm cause-effect relationship, except when you're doing randomized control design. And the other advantage of using a randomized control design is that we can eliminate a lot of bias. Bias may be from the participants. They tend to respond in a certain way. They think that they might think that you want to hear certain answers, so they report that. Some of the studies looking at, for example, sexuality. If you ask your patient, how often do you have sex? They don't want to tell you, every day. And sometimes people may feel, certain culture may feel that, it seems like, very inappropriate to tell people that I have sex every day. So you can see that there is a bias already. And there's also researchers' subjectivity and the way that we may assign certain values. When you're looking at the complications and you know what treatment was being used, if you believe the treatment is supposed to be working, then you tend to minimize some of the complications. you may tend to score higher when you're evaluating the performance of the product. So that is our bias, and we want to, no matter how objective we try to be, there's always a subjective risk. So that's why we want to remove the bias. And also, with the randomized control design, we can remove a lot of confounding variables, because by randomization, we're supposed to equalize the potential confounders, that it should be equally distributed between the treatment group and the control group. Even though it may not always turn out that way, but that's the magic, and that's the assumption behind randomization. This is a typical picture depicting what a randomized control design is like. So you draw you develop your inclusion-exclusion criteria, and when you read a study assessing the evidence, always think about how they select your sample. It should be randomly from a population, not handpicked some of those individuals. And then they continue to be randomly allocated to whether the test group or the control group. And then the allocation should be concealed, should be masked. And also their treatment group assignment should be blinded to both the researcher and preferably to the patient as well, if that is doable and feasible. And then you monitor the outcomes and see what happened to them. And also at the same time, keep track of how many people continue to stay in the group, because attrition is also a problem when you're thinking about randomized control design studies. And that's why there is a consort checklist developed to guide our assessment, appraisal, evaluation of randomized control design evidence. And depends on whether they meet all the criteria, all the major ingredient in the randomized control design. Is the randomization really randomized, really a follow a randomized schedule? Sometimes they say it's randomization, but not always follow the randomization method. Is there concealment? Is there any attrition? So you check off all the boxes to determine the quality of those studies. And this is one of the sort of more recent publications in 2018. I selected this study because it's one of the biggest randomized control design study in ostomy literature. And when you think about the number of people suffer from peristomal damage, I'm surprised that we don't have bigger studies and more robust studies. But this is a randomized control design literature, and the purpose is to evaluate two different types of appliance, and one particularly with ceramide type of flange for protecting the skin and reducing the danger or potential damage to the skin in relation to skin stripping. So as you know, that ceramide is one of the major ingredient in helping to protect the stratum corneum, and it's a moisturizing agent and also a protective agent to maintain the integrity of the stratum corneum. And so they follow a randomized schedule. There is because of the type of devices the patient was wearing. So it was very difficult to blind the researcher and also blind the patient, because they can see what they're actually using. However, I would think that if they want to blind, they can still take off the flange, hide the flange, and ask another person to do the skin evaluation. And of course, if we're asking patient to self-report their symptoms, it will be difficult to blind them. But anyway, still, they have followed a very good process of randomization. They try to conceal the allocation as much as possible. And of course, blinding wasn't so easy to do. And And also the other way of blinding is when they do the statistics, you can also blind the person who's doing the analyses in order to prevent the person from sort of influencing the test they use to analyze the results. And also, I think the outcomes were appropriate. When you're praising the studies, you also look at the outcomes too, right? So there are a variety of different ways of capturing outcomes. You can do self-report tools. You can do observation, looking at the type of skin damage, and also looking at physiological measurements. And in this case, they also evaluate the transepidermal skin water loss, and as part of the evaluation. So you can see a variety of outcomes being included in the study, looking at quality of life, looking at cause, looking at the transepidermal water loss on the skin, and also satisfaction from the patient and clinician perspective, and also the number of occurrence of the complication occurrence, the skin damage. So I think it's a variety of outcomes that's being included in the study. Now, not to say that the more outcomes, the better, because the more outcomes you have, the larger the sample size you may need in order to have the power to evaluate the difference. But in this case, they do have a very good number. So apart from stoma literature, peristomal literature, actually, when researchers, this group of researchers from Ireland, they look at all the different randomized control design studies, they were aghast by how poor the reporting and the publications were, because you can see that not everybody actually report allocation concealment. Not everybody has blinding. Not everybody has complete data sets in terms of looking at the attrition. And not everybody report all the different outcomes. So there's a reporting bias. So there are different biases in all the literature. So I think, and that's why we need to be very critical. We always have to think about how to be very, how to step by step evaluate the various components of a study to determine the quality. Coming back to talk about the importance of variety, the different types of evidence to inform a practice. Just a reminder, it's not just about research, also patient preference, our own experiences, and also the local information. And that's why there are different sources of knowledge to inform a practice, not just about scientific evidence. Yes, we do want to, in this group, we do want to do more research. We want to generate more research, and I will encourage you to do more research as well. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong to think about your clinical experiences and your intuition, the reasoning, and also to think about the variety of information. And that's why when one of the growing interests is using mixed method rather than just using quantitative versus qualitative methodology. So the nice thing is you can combine two different types of data in one study to validate each other, because whether you use a qualitative method, it should produce similar results, a similar idea from a quantitative evaluation. And in this case, you can see that it's like a parallel design. There's quantitative data being collected, at the same time qualitative interviews, focus groups, open-ended questions at the same time. And then at the end, you integrate, you triangulate, compare the outcomes, compare the findings, and see whether they actually converge and whether they are in agreement with each other, in other words. There's also sequential design. You can start with either quantitative or qualitative first, and then you say, well, based on the interviews, I'm going to develop my quantitative instrument so to make it more sensitive to the stoma patients. So then you have the qualitative and the quantitative. So it's a mixed sequential design. And you can also do quantitative first. And then, of course, we know that quantitative methodology may not always give us all the answers. Then you want to go back to ask patients certain questions in order to get the experiences, to get a full picture of what the appliance is like. Even though you can identify there is decrease in complications, perhaps the patient will tell you, well, but it's kind of awkward to wear this, and it's not easy to apply by myself. I need to find some help. So those are the information you may not easily collect from a quantitative methodology without talking to the patients. So switching gear a little bit, because I do want to touch on knowledge implementation. So hopefully the first part of the presentation give you some idea about how to praise the evidence, how to look at the evidence using a more critical eye. What are the different elements, parameters that you need to use to evaluate high quality? And it's not always about high quality, because it's not always about randomized controlled science study either, because you need to look at a variety of different sources of information and different ways of informing your practice. So now, what about knowledge translation? How do we translate? In fact, knowledge translation is a big umbrella term. Under knowledge translation, there is actually knowledge implementation and knowledge synthesis and knowledge dissemination. So those are very different, and there's a whole body of literature to talk about knowledge implementation. And there's a whole body of literature and research looking at just knowledge dissemination. So it is, as you can see on this slide, the different components when you think about knowledge synthesis, knowledge exchange. How do we exchange information where there's clinical experiences or scientific evidence, and then the implementation, and then how do we provide a feedback to the system about communicating the outcome, communicating the implementation results back to help with the synthesis process. Knowledge translation is important because we failed a lot of times, and this is just to illustrate the gap between knowledge and practice. 1/3 of patients, in fact, they don't get treatment of proven effectiveness. Even with all the best practice recommendations, most of the time, clinicians, they rely on what they've been doing in the past, what's convenient for them, and not always about what's been proven to be effective. And 1/4 of patients get care that is not needed or potentially harmful. Medication is a good example. Many patients started on antihypertensive, continue to be on hypertensive medication for a long, long time, even though the blood pressure was low, blood pressure was fine. So potentially it could be harmful. And up to 3/4 of patients do not get the information they need to make decisions. We've been talking about patient engagement and trying to co-design programs for patients. And in truth, there's still a lot of patients don't get the information they need to participate in that decision-making process. And even in Canada, with the availability of education, we still have a lot of people who are not very literate, meaning that they don't really read English very well, and they don't really know how to process information. In fact, a lot of people don't know how to add. Their mathematics is very, very bad. Just to illustrate that there's still a lot of knowledge gaps there. And up to half the clinicians do not get information they need to make decisions. And that's really alarming, staggering in terms of, even though we've been talking about education, and best practice guidelines available to clinicians, people don't always read. People don't always get access to those information because they don't have the libraries, they don't have the time. In my university, in fact, in our province, in Canada, in our country, the funding institute that provide financial means, provide financial support for research, scientific research, medical and nursing research, they talk about this knowledge to action model. And you can see it's like a wheel. And you start with identify the problem. You need to translate that, adapt the knowledge to the local context to make sure that makes sense. Because one good example, because our country is quite big, the best practice is when you have a food infection with diabetes and you want to do a MRI to determine bone infection. But in some areas, they're so remote in the mountains, they would not be able to have access to an MRI machine. Then we might have to adapt the knowledge, the best practices to the local environment. So if you don't have MRI, so what's the next best thing that people should do? So that's a very, very important element in terms of making sure that the context is considered so people can still use the best practice and the knowledge. And then you want to assess for the barriers and facilitators for knowledge use, and then select and tailor to customize the intervention so it can be used locally to local environment. Because we come from different places, different hospitals, different units, different cities, different countries. So you need to think about, and there are different culture in different areas. There are different barriers, different facilitators. And very important is to monitor knowledge use, evaluate outcomes, and the big question mark is how to sustain knowledge use, because there could be a peak of interest when you do something new, but that interest can continue to decline over time. So you need to sustain it and then provide that feedback to the system. And this is just another way of looking at the very complicated model to simplify that into 4 different circles here. Yes, we can do research, create new knowledge. And the knowledge need to be transferred, need to be communicated and translated into usable tools, into usable knowledge, and we can implement that in clinical practice. So in terms of the implementation, there's if you look at Google, there's the implementation science. It's talking about how to actually using strategies to implement certain knowledge, because knowledge, best practice is there. It doesn't always just automatically translate into, or it got implemented in clinical practice. So in this diagram, they talk about the 3 different elements when you think about implementation. Think about the people. It's so important to address the culture of the organization, the type of people you work with, especially nurses. A lot of times, many nurses rely on what they know, rely on their practice in the past, rely on routines. This is the way that we've been doing things. I'll continue to do things the same way. So the attitude is so vital. And also part of the people is to think about administrative people, managers, directors, and executives. How are they going to support knowledge implementation? And the process, do we have a clear process? Let's say you want to introduce a new ostomy product. Do you have a clear process? How decisions being made? Do you have a committee? Who's going to be procuring the product? Do you have all the purchasing people in place to help you with making some of those decisions? So the process, and then from the obtaining the product to making the product available on the unit, to educate people, there's another process in place, right? And the third circle is about technology. You need to think about, especially nowadays, technology is becoming more important to help implementing best practices. Is there an electronic way of helping the dissemination of knowledge? And is there a way to document better, assess the skin lesions better, and then making sure that the platforms are user-friendly, is easy to use, and access to experts like yourself more easily. We just adopted a new system in a hospital for documentation, and there's a lot of learning pain. And we start to really see the value of using this platform, because we can actually chat with each other using just like WhatsApp. But of course, WhatsApp is not protected in the hospital environment. And when we communicate about patient information, has to be in a very protected informatics type environment. So that's why the documentation tool was kind of nice, to be able to have real-time contact, real-time conversation, even though you may have never seen the other individual before, but you talk about patient care directly. And when you think about implementation, I like this model. It's called the Roger diffusion model. What they are saying is 1/3 rule. And when you think about, there's a new innovation, a new technology, new knowledge, not everyone is going to adopt the knowledge, the innovation right away. And they recognize that there are laggers. They're very, very slow to, they always ask questions. They have lots of doubts about why the new approach needs to be used, the new product needs to be used. They don't think it's going to work. And there's also late adopters. So they would wait. They would wait and see. They will observe, but they don't adopt technology or the innovation right away. And then they recognize that there are early adopters. There's also innovators. They like to do new things. They're eager to do new things. Even just one, they just look at innovation, they start thinking about the next innovation already. They look at this new dressing, they will say, oh, I can use this dressing this way, I can cut it this way, I can use it in this type of wound. So those are the innovators, right? I'm sure that there's a lot of innovators in this group here. And that's why we're here, so eager to learn, so eager to change practice. But recognizing that we are the minority, right? We're just small number of people. And what the theory, why it's so important, is what they're saying is, if you want to change, if you want to make sure that this technology innovation is being adopted, don't waste your time to make sure everyone is educated. Don't waste your time to make sure everyone, to expect everyone is going to buy into this new technology. Because what we can influence are the innovators and the early adopters. Maybe 1/3 of the people is going to be adopting the new technology or the new knowledge. So don't expect, when you're doing education, don't expect everyone in the audience is going to say, oh, this is such a big news and we love to try this new product, a new innovation. It's only 1/3 of the people in the group. The smaller the group, the smaller number, of course, right? And you can see that based on this model, they talk about a more sort of sequential change. Change takes time, and allowing the late adopters to really process information. And hopefully, with all the early and late adopters start using technology, then we can change the mindset of the laggers, and they start to come into to join the group, join the majority, so to speak. And I think it's so important as part of this knowledge diffusion, and what Rogers had talked about, not just about the different types of behaviors, how we adopt technology, but also the tools that are available for us to help disseminate, how convince people about the innovation. So there's a technology. We need to use persuasion skills and develop decision tools and then implementation. So part of the implementation, you need to come up with a very clear objective. in a lot of classes, we teach about change behaviors and change policy. We remind people of the SMART objective, S-M-A-R-T. The objective should be very specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. So a lot of times, objective that we see in when people trying to develop a program, when people trying to make change to the organizations, they're not, they say, well, we're going to change the way that we're going to provide care for people with a catheter. But so how are we going to measure that? What kind of resources do we need? Is it relevant to the organization or to that particular unit or certain type of patients? So those are important elements to think about how you develop a better objective. And this is a very complicated slide, but I just want to highlight the importance of providing feedback at the end of the implementation. Providing the information, whether it's successful or not, the lessons we learned from the implementation process, you need to go back to the end users. And that's been really clear in the literature, that feedback, that conversation to tell the nurses at the bedside why this is so successful, why this innovation has failed, can really help to improve the quality of the innovation implementation process. And just going to show you a few other models to help conceptualize the implementation process. This is called the Paris Framework, stands for Promoting Action on Research Implementation in Health Science, in health services. It's a very popular model when we think about evidence, knowledge, implementation. And it's been around for quite some time, but what they have talked about is the 3 dimensions when you think about how to implement research, evidence in the healthcare environment. You need to think about evidence, of course. If the evidence is strong, is high, is convincing, there is a high likelihood for implementation. But at the same time, you have to think about facilitation. You have to think about the context as well. So it's not just about the evidence. So what is the facilitation and what is the context? Facilitation, we're talking about individuals, facilitator. So the leaders, and in this case, when we think about WCN care, we're talking about you as a ET nurse, as a WCN. The way that you can connect with people, you as an opinion leader, how you can lead, and your behavior and your ability to establish relationship with other people. And when people ask me, so what's the key strategy to make a program successful? I always tell people that it's all about who's leading the program, who's providing leadership. If no one is providing leadership, no one is passionate about the project, no matter how good the evidence, no matter how comprehensive the program is, it's not going to work so well. So I think we cannot underestimate the value of you as a ET nurse in terms of translating the knowledge or implementing knowledge into practice. So it's not so much about the nurses. It's about your ability to be able to connect with people. And there's many different leadership style. And for the interest of time, I didn't prepare a lot of slides to talk about the different styles of leadership. And we can appreciate that you don't want to be told what to do. So there are different ways of being more humanistic. There are different ways of being more transformative, more empowering. So I would encourage you to think about, reflect on your own practice, being a leader in your own environment. How do you lead? How do you facilitate change? Remember, we're only there to facilitate. We're not really magician to make a huge difference. And that's why when you think about nursing scholarship, yes, we have scholarship, discovery, generate new knowledge. There's scholarship of integration to work with other disciplines and translate knowledge into practice. But I think part of our scholarship is also a lot of times undervalued, underestimated, is the scholarship of sharing knowledge and teaching, the scholarship of how we teach. And you can immediately think about some good teachers and some not so good teachers. And you want to be the good teachers, you want to be the good facilitator. So I would encourage you to think a little bit more about some of the major characteristics that make a good teacher a good teacher. And also, I think there's a difference between change leadership and change management. Change leadership is about people, about the individual, about the facilitator, how the individual, their characteristics, their stamina, their energy, their attitude is able to make a difference in their own environment. Versus change management is about process. You can have all the process described, lined up, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. But without a change leader, a broker, it's not going to make a difference. It's not going to make a huge difference in terms of shifting organizational culture. So I think, of course, I'm biased. So that's why I always come back to talk about the importance of leadership, the importance of being an individual that has the required personality and quality to make the change. No matter how smart you are, no matter how much you know. And I think the most important part is to be humble, to be able to work with people, to be able to kind and to care. And I don't mean to be too banal about this, because we all care, and that's why we actually volunteer into this kind of profession. But there are different ways of caring and different ways of demonstrating care and different way of how people perceive the care, and that's really important. Okay, moving on. And the other element is about the context. To make the change, remember the 3 components: the leadership, context, the leadership, facilitation, and also the evidence. So now what is context is about the culture, the organization, how complicated it is to make a change, how resistant, how acceptive it is for people to change. In certain organizations, they're so rigid, the morale is so low. I think we all have the experience during COVID that the context, the environment was so poor. The environment, because everyone's so worried, lots of people dying, lots of people getting sick. There's no supplies, and people worry about their own health. So the morale was really bad. So you cannot really implement new changes, because when the morale is low, when you have new innovations, forget it. That's not the time to do anything new. It's a time to repair. It's a time to help, to support each other. Now things are getting better. The morale is better. So then we recognize that the context is changing, that allow us to, with the right leadership, with the right evidence, we can introduce some new innovations and new changes. So we can see the importance of the context. And this is just another pictorial presentation to talk about how we can shift organizational culture, thinking along the line of leadership, thinking about the organizational design and structure. And that's what people learn in business school, is the courses to teach them about how to redesign an organization, to make sure that we can reduce redundancy, that there are strategies to reduce the decision-making matrix, to make it easier for decision to be made on a daily basis. And the other important part is think about competency. How do you articulate what is competent and what is not competent? Performance management. And that's part of shifting the culture. what is the benchmark? What's the criteria that you expect people to do? It should be very, very clearly articulated. Even though we're not really talking about policy in a political sense, but a lot of things we do is we want to change the way that we do things. We want to change standards. We want to change local hospital policy. So you can see that another circle looking at the doing careful planning and looking at the political comments, implementation, and evaluation and feedback to the system. So outcome is a very, very important element in order to help with implementation, because outcome can inform the successful or the failure of your implementation. But when you think about the evaluation of outcomes, it's not just about the end result. I like this model because they talk about outcome evaluation as a process as well. You want to look at the effects of the implementation. You also want to look at the process of how the innovation knowledge is being implemented. So with the implementation, you want to ask about cost. What is the financial cost of changing our practice of a new policy? What's the feasibility? Is this change easy to do, technically possible, right? So if we want to change to a new barrier, is it easy for people to obtain the supply? Is it expensive to change that? And acceptability. Do all the partners, stakeholders, really agree to making that change? We're going from the nurses to physicians to ET nurses to managers. You know, you need all levels of buy-in. So the implementation process to look at to identify all those little measurable goals with implementation. And then the effects component at the end of the implementation. So you want to look at the effectiveness. And we'll come back to talk about what is effectiveness. You want to look at equity. So have we created a new problem that by using this new product, we actually have to cut costs for other products that are available to patients? Then it's not very equitable. Have we created unintended effects? For example, if you introduce a new barrier, and perhaps the new barrier is going to affect the incontinent breathe, and there is an unforeseeable effect on practice. So you only see some of those elements once you have implemented the policy. So, and I think this help you, hopefully, to frame the way that you look at evaluation, not just about the end goal, but also the implementation process, but also not just the cost that is in everyone's mind or the patient's perspective, but also think about all the other components in terms of unintended effects, equity, feasibility, acceptability. So how do we determine cost? There are different types of health economics and cost analyses in the literature. So there's the cost consequence, cost minimization. So let's start with cost minimization. So basically, whatever new innovation, new knowledge, new evidence you want to use, new change in the policy, it should not have a huge difference compared to the cost that was being used before. So it's a cost minimization. So the new change is going to cost minimal, very minimally. And then cost effectiveness. So what is the effective unit that you want to identify? Of course, in the peristomal area, we think about all those complications, leakage, skin damage, erosion, pain as part of the effectiveness. I think we all sort of have a very good idea about cost effectiveness, but want to give you some idea about other type of cost analyses as well. So there's also another type of health economics focusing on cost utility. And what's involved here is looking at the quality of life, and depends on the type of tool that you use to measure quality of life. We can actually translate that into what we call the quality of life years as a measurement of if we use this product, we can actually improve the quality of life for so many years, and compared to the cost. So that's another really important element to bring that human perspective to your cost analyses. And then the last one is cost benefit. It's basically just cost, comparing cost to buy A product compared to cost for buying B product. And doesn't take into account of the effectiveness or the utility or the minimization. So hopefully that sort of gives you some idea about the variety and different tools available for you for assessing and implementing your evidence. I know some of them may be a little bit straightforward, and you might have come across some of those material already. But there may be some new ideas, new tools, a refresher to invigorate you to be the leader, to be and it's not about being firm all the time, but also be a very effective leader, be a humanistic leader in changing your culture. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Professor Kevin. I will synthesize your presentation, but in Portuguese, okay? Because almost of attendees are Brazilians, so I will make a synthesis, okay?
Okay.
Bom, o professor Kevin foi brilhante na sua exposição, fazendo, de fato, uma síntese metodológica, desde apresentar os tipos de estudos, os tipos de estudos que vão nos orientar a como aqueles que vão melhor nos fornecer as evidências. Falou da knowledge translation, então da translação do conhecimento, que implica em síntese, troca, aplicação e disseminação. Falou que existe, sim, um gap entre a evidência e a prática, aquela implementação. Nos apresentou vários modelos para essa implementação de evidências, de novas tecnologias, a difusão das inovações, o que não é simples, né? Desde a criação, transferência, translação e implementação. Falou dos componentes da implementação até agora, então, desde de bolsas para realmente a formação de líderes, a liderança. A gente tem que avaliar o contexto em que essa implementação vai se dar, e falou da importância de avaliação de alguns outcomes, dentre eles a questão da qualidade de vida e a questão dos custos que implicam nesses resultados dessas intervenções aplicadas a partir das evidências recolhidas e implementadas. Nos trouxe uma série de estímulos da importância de trazermos essas evidências para a prática clínica. É um processo complexo a implementação, mas também é um processo dinâmico, desde que a gente conte, a partir dessa análise desse contexto, etc., mas que a gente conte com esse trabalho dos colegas em equipe, para que a gente realmente possa ter, de fato, os resultados a partir dessas implementações. I have two questions here. The questions are in English, so I will read in English as I received that, okay? The first question, Kevin, is about sleep disorders in people with stomas. Renan Alves Silva questioning you about what T nurses or WC nurses are investigating about that issue, about sleep disorders in people with stomas, and what evidence do you have to promote improvement in sleep quality in your country, considering people's preferences? I'm not sure if you understood the question, but about sleep disorders, what are you investigating in Canada? And if you have some interventions according to the patient-centered care.
Well, my answer is quite short. Not much. But I think it's a wonderful area. And you might know better, Professor Vera, because sleep is a huge component for quality of life, of course. And we don't really have a lot of information about individuals' quality of sleeping pattern, sleep disturbance, and sleep issues among individuals with stoma. I would imagine it is a challenge because you have to sleep in a certain position, and you continue to have stool coming out from the stoma. So it's not like when you're sleeping, your gut will stop working either. So some individuals would tell me that they have to wake up in the middle of the night to empty the bag. Of course, that can disturb the sleep. Just like when I had to get up in the middle of the night to go to the washroom, it's taken me a while for me to go back to sleep again. So I think that would be a fascinating area to evaluate sleep disturbance. Now, the interesting question is, what can we do? That's not so easy. Anecdotally, I think we know that people have sleep disturbance.
Of course, we have some technologies improving this kind of pattern, like colostomy irrigation, for example, for colostomy patients, or the bags, the night urinary bags for urostomy patients. But it's not easy. I remember, Kevin, when I know that many programs, INTERUNIDADES in Brazil, we have the experience of use of wear colostomy bag or an ostomy appliance by students. By the students of the INTERUNIDADES. And I remember my doctorate degree thesis was about the results of this experience and published in WCN journal. And I remember that many students wearing the appliances also in a simulated situation, also in not real life situation. The students told about or mentioned about the speeches of the students were about the problems in their sleep patterns. So you can imagine the real life. So it's a gap in literature. I think that it's a very good study. Renan, if you intended to study this, please go on. I have another about sustainability. Is the evaluation based on the evaluation of the fidelity of the implementation? What other options can we use? About the fidelity of implementation, when we talk about sustainability, what other options can we use? I'm not sure if you understood yes, the question is on the screen.
Right. Yeah, I'm
about sustainability is the evaluation based on the evaluation of the fidelity. About the evaluation of the fidelity related to sustainability when you are implementing an evidence.
Yeah, I think it's not that straightforward as you can imagine. With a lot of the implementation science, what the literature is telling us that it's not about one strategy or one thing that is going to help implement the intervention or the evidence. So, and an interesting term about fidelity. In fact, we don't like people to be so loyal to the implementation strategy either. I think it's important to be very fluid in order to be able to adapt and to cater to your local environment. And that's why the evidence-informed practice, you're constantly informed by the changing context, changing environment, because nothing is going to stay the same. Yeah. Today, it may be the same because you're working with certain groups of nurses, but tomorrow it will be a totally different culture environment, right?
Yeah. And the nurses also, the variation of the nurses in the same facility. Another question: how to overcome implementation barriers related to the will of professionals, even when they have knowledge?
I think it's important to engage people as early as possible. And that's why the planning process is so important. You don't want to say, okay, let me plan everything first, and then I'm going to come to you with my plans. You may think it saves a lot of time. You may think that people don't care about planning, but it's not for you to say. It's for them, for other key stakeholders to make that comment. So I think my approach to making changes is to engage as many people as early as possible, even though you don't think they have the knowledge, even though you don't think they play an important part. You never know, but they could play a very important part in terms of creating barriers for you.
There are another question, but I'm not sure if I understood the question. I will read for you. What terms can I use to track research, like the one you mentioned, to measure the future costs of quality of life in relation to the type of product that I currently use?
There is a couple of tools. EQ5 is a very good example for the cost utility type to calculate the what we call quality, QUALYS, the quality of life years. And there's and you have to work with your statistical person to calculate that, but that is one tool available.
Kevin, I think that the in Portuguese, I think that the question refers to the descriptors, to search for search literature. Is this? Que termos posso usar para rastrear pesquisas como as que você falou para medir os custos futuros de qualidade de vida em relação ao tipo de produto que uso atualmente? I think that you must search not about quality of life, but costs analysis. There are many types of cost analysis. There are qualis, EAO. There are many types of analysis of costs analysis. So maybe it's about this, the question. I'm not sure if the question was about this, but in Portuguese I understood like such as descriptors you use. Okay. There are some comments. You can read the comments in YouTube. There are many good comments about your talking. It was very nice, very good. You are really talked about not just methodology, not about the evidence implementation, but you brought us many models about implementation, evidence implementation, and it was very stimulating. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kevin. There is no other question here. I'm not sure if there is anyone, Lais. I don't think so. I don't think so. But the comments, I can see that there are many, many good comments about your lecture. And the people remained in the YouTube. I can see. Okay, acabou mesmo. It's finished. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kevin, for your brilliant lecture. Thank you very much for all of you who remained in the explanation, in the lecture, in the YouTube. Thank you very much. I think that it was a very good tips about investigation, also for all the students are inside the YouTube. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Obrigado. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.